Have a seat, please. Thank you.
There's nothing in here that says. You want me to?
That's blocking me out. I can't see. We can't see the people.
You may have to go back here. I mean, later on. After this session, you may have to go back so at least we can see the audience that can see. She hasn't seen it.
And I have to see the people.
No.
I don't know how to put them there. Blocking the commissioners, and particularly me.
Yes, we will move it off.
Okay. I'm looking for a pen. Thanks. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
On Monday, October 19th, 2020, the Commission of Inquiry began its second hearing pertaining to historic land expropriation in Bermuda. I wish to thank all the witnesses who testified during the second tranche of these hearings. We adjourned on Friday, October 30, 2020, and now after a 2-week hiatus, we are resuming today. To those individuals who are joining us for the very first time, I am retired Justice Norma Wade Miller, Chair of the Commission. I'm assisted in this undertaking by Commissioners, the Honorable Mr. Wayne Perrin-Chief, JP, Mrs. Maxine Binns, Mrs. Frederica Forth, Mrs. Linda Milligan-White, Mr. Jonathan Starling, and Mr. Quinton Stubble. Senior counsel to the Commission is Mr. Dirk Harrison, who resides in Jamaica, but who, in spite of the pandemic, has decided to join us and is here with us in person. I offer a warm but socially distant welcome to you, Counsel Harrison. By way of a brief introduction, Counsel Harrison has served as a prosecutor at the national level in the courts of the islands of Jamaica. He was Deputy Director of Public Prosecutions and Head of the Environmental Law within the office. He was Contractor General as a sole commissioner to the Parliament of Jamaica. He is an independent member as well as the chairman of the Commonwealth Caribbean Association of Integrity Commissions and anti-corruption bodies. Counsel Harrison is assisted by local barrister and attorney, Mr. Bruce Swan. The Secretariat, which supports the Commission, is comprised of Permanent Secretary, Mrs. Marva O'Brien, who is Clerk to the Commission, Mrs. Alberta Dyer-Tucker, and Mrs. Alicia Lister. I remind everyone that the Honorable Premier David Burt, JP MP, establish this commission with investigative, fact-finding, and advisory responsibilities in keeping with its overall mandate. I will not reiterate the commissioner's mandate, as all of this information can be found on the commission's website. We will now pick up where we left off on October 30 and move straight into the next phase of the inquiry, which is to give consideration to some additional matters related to Tuckerstown and St. David's Island, as well as to hear from witnesses who have made representation to the Commission because of issues with land loss in other parts of the island.
Get them to move that right down there.
Yes, they're not hearing me?
I'll get them to move that down.
Okay.
If you do a shorter term.
Did I turn this on?
Yes. It's on. It's okay.
I will now turn this hearing over to Counsel Harrison, who will lead the evidence of our first witness. Counsel Harrison?
Morning, Chairman and your members. The next witness to be taken is Mr. Craig Tucker. However, I'll indicate that Mr. Tucker's evidence will be led, with your permission, Chairman, by Reverend Warren.
Counsel and electronic staff, I'm going to, it has been suggested that we just take a very short adjournment so that this screen that's in front of us can be dropped down. Is that okay? Yes, thank you. Just a very short adjournment. I don't know how long it's likely to take, but we could sit right here. Is it okay? Is it going to be a long exercise? We could sit right here.
Yeah, so I'm going to have to get the tools again.
I was going to suggest, could you drop that right down to floor level? Because then we can look over it and we can see it as a monitor.
It's the display settings down there.
Because you can't see the council.
Yeah, so you see the resident.
Tell the council you can take his mask off. Oh, you want to just...
And counsel, you may take your mask off whilst you speak.
Thank you, Chairman.
It shouldn't take that long.
We don't have no power.
I mean, I don't see why they can't just drop the monitor right down low so we can look over it.
I don't
Because we can see. Let's check your ball.
I'm supposed to wait.
Yeah, if it could go right down to floor level, we'd be happy. We can still see it, and it doesn't block off you.
They can spread out.
suggest that it's
Like, yeah, it's just too far. Way this close.
We're just looking at ourselves.
Taking over. Ours is the only one with the switch for the microphone. All of ours are hot.
yeah, something with when I came here, I plugged in, it was working. And then that screen
I
came
mean,
on. So
the audiovisual people
I don't
using
know
it
what
for
they were trying.
there's the risk of a hot mic.
So it was working.
Tell me about it.
I don't know what they need to do, but it's not my computer.
So try to escape.
They've changed the resolutions and restarted.
Well, it's giving me time to read.
Everything is on my presentation is based on this PowerPoint. I didn't look. It was showing on the main
I haven't read
screen.
this yet. It only came last night.
You'd have to ask.
We have different screens too.
It was working. Yeah, it was working because I tested it when I came here.
Yeah, I was on, that's when we projected, all of a sudden.
It's the same company.
I know what he's trying to say.
That's what I'm thinking. The same thing.
Is this one?
Yeah, really, really. Hey, Mama. Mama. She's gone. This is Swan.
They've got to have the air conditioners on to the three.
Together for the time being.
We didn't need it. We can see the registers clearly, and that's superfluous. Yeah, not zooming. We didn't need it.
Rain. Is this a different company?
Yes.
But we do look pretty. We do look pretty though, so it is nice to see ourselves. We can be a little narcissistic. Yeah. Yeah, work for Trump, right?
That must be this one.
So did Wayne. He got a haircut this morning just so he looked pretty.
Sense.
See? We're all narcissists.
Listen to my message and saying that to bring some plastic cups. I know you're not living from the
All right. Can you imagine?
Can't be seen with the plastic bottle.
Because who's
It hurts my credit.
Yeah,
this going to their mouth while drinking
I
like a
haven't
man?
been able to get on.
Well, unless it's wrong.
Veterans agreed. Mr. Willie
I'm surprised. Looked at.
It was working before we walked
Saying we're bad luck.
They need 7 glasses.
So you go, so we've got to bring it down so you can see it. They can see
You can see it doesn't do the output. Yes, yeah, we didn't need it. We can see our witnesses quite clearly.
Oh, but there's a car up there?
And I guess questions will be answered. I can ask questions of you. Yeah. Which I'll pretty much just follow. Just follow the script. If I'm asking questions.
Can you see over there?
Yes, yes, that's fine.
That's fine?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Top of these off.
Okay. I can't keep it up. It's blowing all over the place.
Yeah, the thing on
Yeah.
just open it up.
It's much better. It's right on there.
When I open mine up, it didn't take hold. I put a bigger.
Yeah, the closer you move, it actually more.
The way you don't.
About our line of sight is over it.
Yeah.
I used the one going like this.
Yeah. I think they can see, can they see counsel from,
Yeah, it's right there.
can they see justice? Yeah. Yeah, we Yes, that's
It
fine.
might work, it might not work. It might work, it might not work.
That's a lot. I still got to be a bit jealous. Yes.
Yeah. Or you can even wait for one at a time.
That's why they need it.
These are when Ding is real.
That's what I heard.
It's on? It's on. Thank you, gentlemen. That's much better. We're able to see everyone, and I believe they're able to see us. Counsel, I believe you were going to call your first witness, Mr. Tucker, and we will have him sworn, or I'll just put things in your hands.
Thank you, Chairman. We'd like to call the first witness. He is Mr. Craig Tucker. I'd ask for him to be sworn.
Mike.
The microphone is not
Craig Darren Tucker. Sorry. Craig Darren Tucker.
I, Craig Darren Tucker,
I, Craig Darren Tucker.
I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence that I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Madam Chairman, with your leave, I know the standing had been given to Reverend Whalen. I ask your permission to allow him to lead this witness.
Very well, counsel. Mr. Tucker may take his mask off while he speaks, if that's preferable.
That's fine. Thank you.
Good morning, Madam Justice, and to Counsel Derek Harrison, and to all of the commissioners and everyone. Good morning. We are thankful for the opportunity to present on behalf of Marston First United Methodist Church, formerly Marston Memorial Methodist Church, and our former trustee chairman, Mr. Craig Tucker, is by my side, and I am going to allow him to present on behalf. Mr. Tucker, can you tell us your date of birth and where you reside and where you graduated and your employment?
My name is Craig Darren Tucker. I was born on July 26, 1959 in Devils Hill in Smith Parish, Bermuda. I currently live at 10 Morgan Hill in Sandys. I'm a graduate of Babson College in Boston with a Bachelor of Arts in Business Administration. I'm currently a retired Vice President of HSBC with over 30 years experience.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker. Can you speak about your family ties with Tuckerstown?
Sure. My family roots are in Tuckerstown. My ancestors are what they can call in Bermuda the Talbot brothers. It's my great uncles, of which my father and my uncle actually joined them because they were a generation before them. The Talbot brothers actually had a set of twins who were buried in the old Marsden Cemetery in Tuckerstown. They would have been my grandmother's brothers. They died as children. My great-grandmother was Mamie Susan Kennedy Augusta Lambert, and she married my great-grandfather Osmond Charles Frenshaw Talbot, and they lived in Tuckerstown in a house that's now currently called Atlanta by the Sea. So it was right close to the graveyard, and as well as the church in Tuckerstown. Numerous ancestors from Tuckerstown are associated with Marsden members. The Talbot families, the Burgess family, the Richardson and Steed families, the Smith family, the Musson family, and the Trott family, and numerous others were attached within the Tuckerstown environment. And when they were removed in the early 1920s, they essentially moved to the Smith Parish area. Now, not everybody actually stayed in the Devil's Hill area. Some people went all the way back to Somerset, and since I moved up to Somerset, I've also found out that I have a ton of relatives up in Somerset as well, which is nice to hear. There's numerous families around that attach themselves to Tuckerstown, and their roots being in Tuckerstown. But for us, why we're here today largely as a result of the church and our direct connection with the graveyard in Tuckerstown. I have been a lifelong member of Marsden Memorial Methodist Church, and I served as the chairman and trustee board of the Marsden Memorial Methodist Church for over 14 years, and was a key player in its transition to the United Methodist Church in 2001. Hence the name change to Marsden Fresh United Methodist Church. I was a trustee chairman when the ground penetrating survey and subsequent alterations to the cemetery were done.
Thank you, Craig. If you could talk about Marsden's particular association with the Tuckerstown community and the history of Marsden, if you could share that.
Marsden Church was originally founded, or the Tuckerstown Church was originally founded over 170 years ago. It was very much trying times. Bermuda essentially was a segregated society. They were forced to move, and as a result, we ended up in on South Shore in Harris's Bay. But continuously, we've always been concerned about the area in Tuckerstown, particularly the graveyard. And as a result of that, before the church was physically moved, people had to have been buried in Tuckerstown, as you've heard from previous people that have been here and presenting. We don't have an idea as to where all the other people prior to the church being established would have been buried. But for us, we know that the one area that we believe wasn't conveyed was actually the graveyard itself. And that graveyard has been associated with the Marsden Church.
Can you give a little flavor of the old Marsden Church in Tuckerstown?
The church, as you, I don't know whether you have been down there or not, but as you drive as you drive into Tuckerstown, there is a overpass, like a walkway if you're a golfer, and then it comes to a fork where there's two roads. One goes up to Mid-Ocean Club, and one can go down the hill. The first building there on the left was the Sunday school, and as you drive down the hill on the left, that was the church building. Now, why the grave was so far away from the church, that's unbeknown to me, but people had to find an area where they could create a graveyard type of environment. There's a lot of caves in Tuckerstown. You will find, and I think that whole area between there and all the way around to I think the Shell gas station, essentially, all along Castle Harbor and the coast there. There's a lot of caves along there. And the grave was situated essentially where it was, and there was hard rock at that time, and people had to dig the graves by hand in those particular days. So the graveyard essentially is where it is. Now, I will confess to you that we had a difficult time trying to get a lot of information out of a lot of the elderly people who were removed from Tuckerstown. Some were forthright, but I can tell you that we had some family that didn't talk about it very much. It was sort of ancestral forgetfulness, I guess. They sort of just left it alone. We've tried to interview some of the people, and as they would say, just leave well enough alone and just get on with the movement of the church and doing what it needs to do in terms of saving people's lives and moving them closer to God. So the challenge has been ongoing for us. Some of the people that you've heard from in the past, some of them are my relatives, like Mr. Stubble, and other people are relatives of ours, and originally would have been associated with the church in some way, shape, or form. Either them or family members would have been associated with the church.
So the lack of conversing about the past sounds a lot like what Dr. Lister was presenting to the Commission with regards to historical amnesia, and that attributed to the fact, did it not, that for a period of time the cemetery was neglected?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So can you speak to the question of ownership?
My recollection of what I've been heard before coming here is that the graveyard, all the other property was essentially conveyed to the new developers. But the graveyard, from what I can gather, was not conveyed, and that it still existed down there, and that they were supposed to take care of that property on an ongoing basis, just like other graveyards in Bermuda have been taken care of. And because of the neglect by previous trustees of the Marsden Church, were not forcefully taking care of it as they probably should have. But mind you, there were some very trying times for Bermuda at that time, because we're talking in the late 1920s. There were still challenges around the black community in terms of what they could essentially do in certain areas, and one of them would have been in Tuckerstown at that particular time.
Now, in your statement, you refer to the former ombudsman, Ms. Arlene Brock, in terms of what she stated in her report, a grave error with regards to the question of ownership.
Her essential conclusion is as follows, and I like to quote her, and she said, "In my opinion, there can be no doubt that Marsden First United Church is the natural inheritor of the Marsden Cemetery in Tuckerstown. However, as a site of unique national significance, and also given the fact that descendants are not limited to the Marsden congregation, it is my considered opinion that inheritance does not connote exclusive decision rights regarding the 1920 Methodist Cemetery."
All right, thank you. Now, with regards to the, when you were chairman of the trustee board, during the time when the ground penetrating survey, can you speak about the trustees at that particular time?
I was the trustee chairman when the ground penetrating survey and subsequent alterations to the cemetery were done. The trustees serving during this time in question was myself, Craig Tucker. I was a vice president at HSBC. Charles Burgess, who was a taxi driver. Roland Darrell, whose mother actually came from Tuckerstown. He was into construction. Delroy Duncan was a partner with Trott and Duncan. Delwyn Riley was a senior cable splicer for Bermuda Telephone Company. Henry Trott was a retired construction operator. Gil Tucker, who's actually my brother, was the office managing partner of Ernst & Young Bermuda. And Rodney Tucker, who was my father, was an organist for 68 years at Wesley Methodist Church in Hamilton for 30 of those 68 years, and was the organist at Marsden Church for over 68 years. And Rosemary Yarham, who was a retired registered nurse.
Thank you. I'm not certain, but I believe we might have excluded another female trustee member at the time. Was Michelle Brock Jackson a member at that time?
I'll have to test my memory. I can't remember. But if you think she was, then she would have been.
Okay.
And Michelle Jackson now works for Bermuda Fire and Marine. I think she's senior vice president. I think at Bermuda Fire and Marine, I believe. Mm-hmm. She was at Argus and moved over there.
But the important element is that a number of these trustees would have had some connection with the Tuckerstown history.
Yes, in some way, shape, or form, either through marriage or connectivity by families. A lot of them would have had a direct connection to that, to the Tuckerstown area.
Now, there were a number of adverse statements presented to the commission with regards to the cemetery. And I was wondering if you could speak to some of those adverse statements.
The adverse statements that I have seen where the graves essentially were not destroyed, and I want to be clear on that they were not destroyed. The graves were not dug up. No bodies were removed from the graves. And that if you look at some of the pictures, I don't know if you had one up there, I don't know if
I believe
you wanted to show it.
Make a reference to the Royal Gazette article dated this October the 17th, 2012. I believe a witness cited this article as proof that the graves were dug up. Is it your understanding that this is what that article represents?
It wasn't my understanding that that's what it represents. I think they were, I can essentially say that as a church.
Chairman, if I may, the article that's being reference is being made to, is it an exhibit?
Yes, sir.
Could it just be shown to the witness? Do you have it there?
It's in the packet.
Is it on here?
Could you just for the record, because we need to ensure it's reflected, could you just show it to the witness? Madam Clerk, if you could assist.
Me, I guess.
The witness has it. I believe it's in the binders of.
Madam Chairman, are you and commissioners, are you seeing the document, or would you like?
It would be right after the history of the church.
You want to show it to him?
Just started there.
This one?
Yes.
We saw it. That's what I can see here.
It's the same.
Yeah. Same one.
You have found
You see
it,
it?
Chairman.
We're looking right here.
Mike?
Photographs.
19. I think that's.
Yes, we've been supplied with a booklet with photographs in it, and I think if you could point to the photographs and then identify that is what we're seeing, that would be very helpful.
Yes.
And I have the one that he's pointing to.
Very well, Chair.
To your reading, is there anywhere in the article in the Royal Gazette which is entitled "Restoration Work at Graveyard Upsets Custodian Group"? Is there anywhere in that article that references the graves being dug up?
I don't recall there being any evidence of the graves actually being dug up at that
Tell me,
particular
please,
article.
Pastor, are we entering these photographs as exhibit? Because I noticed that I have the booklet here, and it's Marsden 002. Council, are we going to enter them as exhibits? Do you have a booklet with the photographs?
We are going to enter them, Chairman.
Sorry?
We are going to enter them.
Okay. In due time?
Yes. in due
Or,
time.
okay.
I
Go
will
ahead.
just allow the witness to complete his answers in respect to the photograph, then I would
Okay.
make an application to you.
Very well. Go ahead, please.
The point that I wanted to make, that it was within that article, there was no sense of the bodies being removed. There was no, in that article, there was no recollection of the bodies being moved. And on top of that, I would like to add that we are a church, and all of our family essentially were living in Tuckerstown, and we certainly have an affiliation with that particular graveyard, and in no way, shape, or form would we be looking to remove bodies from the actual graveyard itself.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker. Would you speak to the trustees' decision to remove the concrete slabs?
The trustees of Marsden had consented to the removal of the concrete slabs as they were not part of the original graves. What we had found was, unbeknown to us, we had worked with Dr. Harris because we needed some historical information on the protection of a graveyard. And he told us that the work that had been done down there did not fairly represent the original state of the graves that were originally in Tuckerstown. So between Bermuda Properties and Rosewood and apparently Dr. Harris, they went ahead and did the work unbeknown to us at Marsden to get the graveyard back to its original state. And that's why you see in that same picture why they dug around to get it back to the same state that originally was, because we did not want that particular graveyard to be adjusted in any way, shape, or form. We also, at the same time, some graves were thought to have been found outside of the graveyard, and a piece of that wall actually had come down as well, because the graveyard could actually be bigger than what the walls were around it. And all of those walls weren't originally there in the graveyard. Some of them were built up at a later date.
Just, Madam Chairman, just to ensure, there's a document photograph which has at the top right-hand corner Marsden 002.
Yes.
That is a photograph that you're referring to now.
Yes.
Could I ask Chairman as to attend as an exhibit?
Yes, I will. Now, do we enter it as under pastors W? What? Please give me your initials, Pastor W.
JW?
JW?
Well, JFW?
JFW. And should we enter it as JFW1?
Very well, Chair.
Yes. So this Marsden 002 restoration work at the graveyard is now entered as JFW1.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I just want to reassure that the trustees asked for and were given verbal assurances that nothing of the original structure of the graves would be violated. And I want to make that point clear.
Can you speak to, in your statement under number F, you talked about the extent of the church involvement in that work. Can you speak to that?
The church did not participate in any way in the work done at the cemetery. The church did not know when the work began. No representative of the church was consulted or on site. No one from the church participated in overseeing the work, and the church has no knowledge as to who did the work, nor of the terms of the agreement between Rosewood Tuckers Point and whoever the contractor was. Please keep in mind that all of the land that surrounded the graveyard, we essentially would need permission to be able to go across that land before we could do any work. And between Bermuda Properties and Rosewood, they were the ones who, along with Mr. Ed Harris, were the ones who were going to put the grave back to where its original state was. We were concerned that with the build-up of the sides of the walls and the new tops and everything that was put on there wasn't representing the original state of the graveyard. And in essence, what we wanted to do was to get the graveyard back to its original state that we found it in.
So thank you, Mr. Tucker. And addressing the adverse statements, there were also some statements presented to this commission in which the church is in agreement. Can you speak to those?
Well, the things that we are in agreement with, and there are other people as well outside of the church that still want to dwell on the history of the Tuckerstown Cemetery and Tuckerstown in general. The trustees of Marsden are in agreement with efforts to determine the actual scope of the cemetery. We want to know whether it was bigger, whether it was any other graves in the Tuckerstown area. We, quite honestly, don't know. But prior to 1830, when the church was created in Tuckerstown, people obviously passed away in Tuckerstown, and people were obviously buried within that area somewhere. In relation to the church, since then, everybody that was essentially buried that died in Tuckerstown were either buried in either St. George's, St. Mark's, or in Tuckerstown, of which the majority of them would have been buried in Tuckerstown. The trustees joined with renewed calls for the redirection of the driving range. I'm sure you all have been down there and seen the driving range. It really is, in my view, very poor taste for them to put it in that location, because when the balls are hit, they essentially drop into the cemetery. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're still quite upset about. That we don't like that. We had an agreement with Rosewood that they were supposed to put some form of a netting or some cover over it to be able to keep the golf balls out. In our view, we feel that the graveyard, the driving range, essentially should be moved. There's tons of land down there. The Bermuda Properties had quite a big piece of property down there. It was over 200 and something acres, I believe, or maybe even more. And there's really no need for the driving range to be where it is. I don't quite understand how they received permission to put the driving range right next to a cemetery, but I think it's very unfortunate that the balls actually continue to this day. dropping into the cemetery. And moving forward, the trustees supports efforts for inclusion of all the stakeholders in restoring and protecting the cemetery, healing the community and honoring the legacy of the old Tuckerstown community is an important outcome that we continue to aspire to. And also, I would like to mention to you that there were essentially two churches down in Tuckerstown, and I don't particularly want to represent the St. Philip's AME Church, which obviously moved near Somersault Road in the Devils Hill area, but just before the entrance to Somersault Road. It's called St. Philip's AME Church. Their church was right at the junction of Painters Road, where you make the left to turn into Tuckerstown. It was up on a hill there. So that whole community, they didn't have a graveyard, but that whole community that attended the AME Church would have also buried people probably in the Tuckerstown graveyard as well. And I don't know whether they're going to report, and I don't speak on their behalf, but there would have been people that from that church that would have been buried down there. I would also like to mention that my great-grandmother was the organist at the Tuckerstown Church, and when they were removed in the 1920s, she continued to play at Marsden Church, where it is currently located, and then her daughter, which was my grandmother, took over as organist of Marsden Church, and then when my father got of age, he then became the organist of the church and was there for over 68 years.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker. Counsel, that concludes my question of the witness. I would simply like to ask if it is possible during my subsequent presentation if Mr. Tucker could assist as a witness.
Madam Chairman, I think Reverend Wallen wishes to be sworn after an opportunity is given. If there are any questions, I have a few, but I think what he's indicating is that he wishes to also be sworn after we conclude asking questions.
Quite. So in the first instance, you'll ask this witness questions, and then thereafter, Pastor will be sworn?
No, thereafter, yourself and your commissioners
Okay.
would ask questions.
All right. Go ahead, please, Counsel.
Morning again, Mr. Tucker. Mr. Tucker, can you, in terms of the ancestors you mentioned, the Talbots, can you give us a timeline how far back that goes?
I'm going to be guessing. I just want to be clear. But my great Uncle
I'm
Austin.
going to ask you to talk into the microphone.
Oh, sorry. My Uncle Austin, who was the oldest child who played, I don't know if you're familiar with the band, but used to play the one-string bass for the Talbot Brothers. He was born, I think, in 1905. So he would have been, and then he was the oldest, and then the other children came after that during that period.
Okay.
So they essentially lived in Tuckerstown
Thank you.
for a portion of their life.
The information upon which you have relied on and shared with us, what is the source of the information?
Family.
It has been handed down to you?
Yes. I had to fight for some of the information because some of them didn't want to discuss how life was down there. Some people were willing to give information and some people weren't. But I just want to be clear that this only came to light in the church probably in the maybe the 80s or 90s about the graveyard and our interest in trying to get it restored.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned earlier that at the time of the ground penetrating survey, you were at the time trustee chairman, and you are still the trustee chairman, is that correct?
I am not.
I want to speak a little bit about the ground penetrating survey that your advice took place. Prior to the survey being done, or you being advised that there had been some disturbance of the cemetery site, what was your understanding that would have taken place in terms of restoration of the cemetery?
We, as I had stated earlier, we wanted the graveyard to be put back to its original state. We appreciated that they had tried to square off the graves and put new tops on them so people can identify them or what have you. But it was our view as a trustee board that the grave site itself, in our view, was very precious to us, and we wanted to be put back the same way that it would have originally been at that particular time.
Can you say you had an expectation that you would have been contacted prior to the start of the restoration? Is that your expectation?
We didn't know, as chairman of the trustee board, we didn't know what they were essentially going to do down there. It was really under the operation of between Dr. Harris as well as Bermuda Properties or Rosewood Guest House at that particular time. In hindsight, yes, maybe we should have probably have known what they were looking to do. But remember, essentially, we didn't think anything was going to offend the church in what they were going to do. We just were hoping that, along with Dr. Harris, that we were hoping that the graveyards would be put back in its original state.
You have mentioned Dr. Harris. Did you or any member of the church have any discussion with Dr. Harris prior to you being notified that there had been some disturbance at the cemetery?
Well, I can talk to that. I think Reverend Whalen will probably have more information on that, and I would ask you to refer that question to him so that we can both answer at the same time. But yes, we essentially brought him in because he's a noted historian in Bermuda, and we needed to find somebody that knew about old graveyards and somebody that could help us with what we needed to do to restore the graveyard and get it cleaned up and walled and what have you.
Yes, thank you. But particularly as it regards the restoration, was there any discussion? I'd asked Reverend Shortman, but was there any discussion with the trustees in respect of any role that Dr. Harris would play regarding the restoration?
He mentioned to us that he would get along with the work to make sure that it's done properly. And we had insinuated to him that we wanted the graveyard to put back to its original state.
Now, a witness, Mr. Stovell, had given evidence before the commission, and he spoke of research that he had conducted, and he indicated that his research had revealed 164 deaths in Tuckerstown between, and I read particularly from his statement, it had revealed 164 deaths in Tuckerstown between 1879 and 1923, 32 adult males, 46 adult females, 38 boys, 36 girls, and 2 stillborn infants. I note that I make reference, it's a long run-up for my question, forgive me.
That's all right.
I note also the report of the Ombudsman, grave error, and I make particular reference to one of your recommendations, and the recommendation speaks particularly to the expansion, and let me find it particularly. The church agreed, it is E in your statement, the church agreed that the eastern wall be extended to include graves outside the boundary. So my question is, In light of the research and work of Mr. Stovell, on the one hand, and on the other, based on the findings of the work of Dr. Harris and Dr. Tribby, I think.
Triggs.
Triggs, thank you. Some 8 graves, 8. 8, I think, were located. Is there any concern in respect of the Marsden United Church and the trustees that there are other graves there? Because on the one hand, Mr. Stovell speaks of his research of 164 deaths. However, what appears at the cemetery now is a number that is many times smaller.
Yes.
Do you have any concern in this regard in terms of why is it that you seek to have the walls extended, and why would you want to have this study?
We as I said earlier, we assumed that prior to 1830 or 1835, whenever the church was created, people must have passed away in Tuckerstown and probably are buried somewhere in Tuckerstown. Now, I have no idea where that will be, but I agree with Mr. Stovell that there could be another graveyard in Tuckerstown. However, that graveyard was not associated with the Tuckerstown Methodist Church. The graveyard that we're concerned about, what we're talking about today, is the graveyard that was associated with the Tuckerstown Methodist Church in Tuckerstown. And when we saw those additional bodies that could potentially be outside of the wall of the grave, then obviously we would want to include them within the graveyard itself.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned earlier the correcting some adverse statements. Yes, it's important, but I realize much emphasis has been placed on it. Can you speak a little more on it? Because I would say the impression is given that the graves were desecrated. They were completely damaged. And you have sought here to correct these statements. Would it be correct that what in fact happened, it is what was on the top surface that had been removed?
Yes.
And your statement seeks to settle the concern that anything had been dug up or bodies removed?
No bodies were removed at all. And in fact, if you look at the Marsden 002, that picture,
Yes.
Hopefully you have it, you can see the surfacing where they removed the area around the individual graves, because remember, they're trying to find essentially where the graves are, because it was all essentially overgrown at one point. The majority of it was just a few small little pockets on top of the grave. And you can see where they cleared it out, but you don't see any digging or anything within the grave itself.
Thank you. You also gave evidence earlier, and it's in your statement where you spoke about the trustees asked for and were given verbal assurances that nothing of the original structure of the graves would be violated. However, in fact, are you of the opinion that they were violated?
It's my opinion that they may or may not have been violated. I don't know, because I didn't essentially see the graves prior to them actually digging up. I just know that it was essentially a flat piece of land there with bodies underneath the grave. So when they dug up to find out where the actual graves were, that's the picture that you see here in terms of what we have.
Can you, as the then chairman of trustees, speak a little to the fact that the church had not been consulted prior to the work beginning, the work that is associated with Dr. Harris at the cemetery?
All that I can say is when we found out that what had happened, we were, as a church, we're embarrassed because that's not the what we wanted to be on the front page of the newspaper or within the newspaper. We were obviously very concerned, and all of our members were also concerned. And the extent of it happening certainly concerned the church in general, which will include the trustees and the members and everybody at the church.
You mentioned also the fact that access to the cemetery is not, well, you don't have access. Do you have access today?
We have to essentially get permission to be able to go with it. If we wanted to have a service, which we've done twice, 3 times, we've had services down there, we have to get permission from, at that time it would have been Bermuda Properties, to be able to go down there. Because essentially what happens is there's a fairway that runs behind the church and the graveyard. There's a huge fairway. And in order for people to cross over to get to the graveyard, they have to essentially shut down the golf course.
How do you feel about that? Having to ask for permission each time. How do you feel about that?
It essentially hurts. I mean, we don't like that. Clearly the church doesn't like that either. But to try to rebuild that from 1920 is going to be a challenge. I mean, I don't physically know how you would actually change that because it would cause a redirection of the golf course itself, just like it would cause Rosewood to have to move their golf club, essentially, because that's where the balls are dropping into the graveyard. And those are major expenses for the owners of the golf course to take on. But my humble opinion is, no, we don't like it.
And if you wanted to acknowledge the opportunity in respect of the chairman and the commissioners, what would be one of your wishes as regards access to the graveyard? Do you have one that you would like to make to the commissioners?
Well, I would like for it to. Well, there's a few things. The long side, it would be nice if we had access to the graveyard. I don't realistically think that's going to happen, but we hope that it could happen. But what we essentially want is for the graveyard to be protected by any means necessary by Bermuda Properties or Rosewood, who currently own it. We don't want any golf balls in there. We want it to be 100% protected with no inference it being abused by anybody. And I think the consensus has been from all the people that have attended services or anything down in Tuckerstown, that's the general consensus, is that we would want the graveyard to be 100% protected.
I have no further questions, Madam Chairman. I just wish to bring to Reverend Whalen's attention. I think there's some other photographs that he may wish to rely on. I wish to have those tendered admitted as exhibits. They are included in his document, but I think what we could do, we could, through Reverend Whalen, when he gives evidence, we could tender them then. But there's some other photographs on which reliance could be.
Quite. Thank you. Thank you, Council. Thank you, Council. We'll have commissioners ask their questions now. And I believe after that, Reverend Whalen is going to do a PowerPoint presentation. And at that point, perhaps you could enter your additional photographs if you so wish. Ms. Ford, question, please.
I have just one to Mr. Tucker. Good morning. So is it my understanding that when the property was taken by compulsory purchase, it did or did not include the cemetery?
From what we've researched, it did not include the cemetery. Everything else was conveyed, but not the cemetery.
So Was it then, you said you were prevented, or the church was prevented from maintaining the gravesite because they needed to seek permission? So from 1920, 23, when it was purchased, the church could not physically go in and maintain the gravesite? Is that what happened?
Essentially, yes. We would have to go to, probably at that time, it would have been Bermuda Properties to be able to get access down there. But remember, there were, what was it, 3 years, I think, before the church was actually built? I think it took between 1920 and 1923. People still used to go to church in Tuckerstown, even though they had moved. They used to still go to Tuckerstown and go to church. So during that period, people still could have access essentially to the graveyard while they were developing houses and whatever else they were doing down there. But yeah, essentially, once all the houses were built and everything was done down there, we would have to essentially receive permission from Bermuda Properties to be able to get to the graveyard.
So during that whole period, from 1923 thereabouts, did the church then at any time go to maintain the grave sites?
They didn't, and that would have been prior to my time and involvement with the church. And keep in mind that, Bermuda was a segregated society. It was just a lot of stuff you just couldn't do. You can't just walk into Tuckerstown and say you're going to cross the golf course and go to a graveyard. So I think, that historical dilemma is something that, that affected the church, and we needed to adjust to that. And it wasn't until in later years, probably in the 70s or 80s, when people finally built up enough nerve to really say, let's go down there and let's try to resurrect it and get it right.
Thank you. Somewhat what Mrs. Lister had talked about in her presentation with regard to the psychological effect it may have had on the church, which may have prevented them from maintaining the property.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mrs. Milligan White, would you?
Yes. Good morning.
Good morning.
Could you explain to me the role of Dr. Harris in your negotiations regarding the grave sites? Because I got the impression this morning that Dr. Harris was retained by the trustees.
Yes.
But his actions, he never consulted you on any particular aspect. Is that correct, or is that not correct?
Well, again, as I said to the gentleman over there, I would say to you that I'm sure Reverend Ravens can have an answer for that as well. But the reason we hired him was because he was in the historical aspects in terms of being able to deal with graveyards and old buildings and that sort of thing. So it was recommended that we hire him and use him. Now, whether he was essentially, Reverend Ravens may be able to add to that, but whether he was involved when the graves were being changed down in Tuckerstown, I'm not 100% sure of that. But it was done, I can tell you, without the notice of Marston Church.
And presumably you've checked the records of the church. There must have been correspondence between the two entities, Dr. Harris and the church.
I would just pose to say that I think Reverend Reardon may have some comments on that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. Mr. Parent-Chief?
Yes, good morning, Ms. Tucker.
Oh, can I just say one point?
Yes.
We didn't hire him. He wasn't paid by the church. We just used him as a historical factor in terms of helping us to identify the graveyard.
Okay.
Big difference.
Yes, it is a big difference, yes.
Mr. Parent-Chief?
Yes, Mr. Tucker. My questions would be a continuation of the hiring or the commissioning or hiring of Dr. Harris, and what direction he actually had from the trustees. And the answer seems to be that he was basically given carte blanche to do the restoration. Is that correct?
not carte blanche to do the restoration, but in a sense, he was to put the graveyard back to how it originally was.
Yes.
That's what we wanted.
We were made aware of a group, the Tuckerstown Historical Society, which basically comprised of at least 3 members who've given evidence to this commission, Mr. Richardson, Mr. Stovall, and Mr. Dubois. What was your relationship, or the relationship of the trustees with this group?
Well, let me say this, that we have had discussions with them originally, and I think in Reverend Whalen's comments, he'll respond to that as well. But we originally, when we first found out about it, we had met with Bermuda Properties at the old, I think, Castle Harbor, I think, at that particular time. And some of them were there, and they had comments. I think this was prior to them actually setting up the Tuckerstown Historical Society. They were a registered charity, I believe. You know, the interest that they have in making sure that the graveyard is preserved and taken care of is the same that we have as a church. It's not a lot of difference in there. The only query that we have with them is the concern about bodies being removed from the grave. And I just want to be able to clarify that they were not removed from the grave, and that Mr. Harris was to be able to put the graves back to its original state. Now, the other Mr. Harris talked with Bermuda Properties and got them to go ahead. I'm not 100% sure of that, but because we were shocked as well when we saw the pictures of what you see here in terms of Marsden 002.
Yes. Regarding the actual restoration, the work itself of the graveyard, as the trustees of the graveyard, was any permission requested of planning department, the government planning department, to do the work?
As far as I know, no. But I'm not 100% sure of that. But my guess is no, there wasn't any. And remember, the golf course, all the land around the graveyard belonged to Bermuda Properties. So it's their land, I mean, in terms of what they wanted to do. Essentially, there's been some checking on if you're going to remove bodies from a grave. I don't think you can just do that. I think you need to get permission to be able to do that. And that's why we know that we wouldn't have given permission for any bodies to be removed.
Right.
And we're pretty clear about that.
Right. An obvious question. What has your subsequent, behavior or actions been to sort of reconcile the issue between the issues that arise with the Tuckers Point Development Company, I believe now, and your situation with the graveyard? Obviously, it appears to be in some sort of limbo. Can you explain what the relationship is now, or recently, quite recently?
The last meetings we had with Rosewood would have been that they were supposed to erect a netting so that when people hit the balls on the driving range, the balls would go into the net and drop outside of the graveyard. I can honestly say that we were 100% happy with that, but that was sort of a make-between in terms of them essentially moving the driving range itself. But our goal is not to have any balls in the driving range, and we are still upset the fact of the condition of the graveyard and the way that it's been kept. And we are very much concerned, just as the Tuckerstown Historical Society are as well.
And just again, the relationship with Dr. Harris, does he have any thing to do with the graveyard at all at this point?
Probably not at this point, but I think Reverend Whalen is going to have some information on that as well when he presents.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tucker.
Thank you. Mr. Sarli?
Hi, good morning.
Morning.
I've got a few questions, but I'll try to keep them brief. One question is, when the restoration, well, the action that happened that led to the removal of the graves, part of that was also to extend the graveyard to the east to factor in the additional graves that were found by the ground-penetrating radar. Is that correct?
To the section of the graveyard where they found bodies, yes.
Yes. From my
I think
understanding,
that was on the western side, I believe. Was it eastern or western? It's the eastern side, yeah, okay.
from my understanding, although they did knock down part of the wall, instead of extending it, they just rebuilt that wall. So the only actions that happened was temporary removal of the wall, repairing of that wall, but the removal of the physical grave. Is that correct? Was the wall extended?
If I may refer to Mr. Whalen, if you don't mind.
Should I withhold that question until Reverend
Well,
Rayland?
there's some questions that I think we both have answers to. So, it's sort of one-sided, and I want to make sure, because I've been away from Marsden Church for a few years. So I haven't, but I'm very much interested in the graveyard itself and it getting back to its normal state. But if you want to refer to Reverend Reardon, if you can ask that question then we can both answer.
Okay, I'll stay that question for the moment.
Sure.
I understand what you said, that currently you need permission to access the cemetery, at least for your big services. But for individual members to go and visit the site, you don't need to ask that direct permission?
Yes, you do, because you're not supposed to be in Tuckerstown. You have to be a member of Mid-Ocean Club or Castle Harbor Golf Club, I guess, in order to be able to access the grounds, which is the golf course, in order to get to the graveyard itself.
The reason I was asking is, we know from a previous witness who presented here that he had visited the site in the late 1980s and he took photos off the existing remnant tombs. And that was what I understand from the report, the false sarcophagi were protecting those. So I'm not understanding why the church trustees were not aware of that when this occasion happened. There seemed to have been a miscommunication or a loss of information there. Would that be correct to say?
Yeah, I guess in a roundabout way, but I think, again, that's a question that both of us can ask again. We can answer that.
I just have one more question.
Sure, that's fine.
You made a point that you did not hire Dr. Harris. You consulted him.
Yes.
Do you know if Dr. Harris had any relationship? Was he also consulted with or hired by Mid-Ocean Club in this process?
My recollection is no.
Okay.
I don't know, is my point. Not that it's not my understanding that he did, but he may have. But my guess is no, he didn't.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Tucker.
Mrs. Spence? Thank you, Mr. Starling.
Yes. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
I'm going to cross-reference the Marsden Exhibit 002, I believe it is, or it's been given another reference. No trustees or members of Marsden Church were consulted or attended the site when the work was being carried out. As a point of clarification, are you saying that Marsden relied on the verbal reassurance from Bermuda Properties Limited and Dr. Harris that the graves were not destroyed or dug up, or no bodies were removed from the grave? Was that a verbal confirmation from?
Well, essentially, you can't, as a church, you just can't take a body out of a grave and just move it. I think you have to get permission to be able to do that. So if they wanted to do that, they would have to come to the church, essentially, to get permission to do that. So.
But there's a possibility that they didn't come to the church to seek that.
There could have been that possibility, but knowing Dr. Harris, my guess is I wouldn't expect that to have happened.
Okay.
But he may not have been there when Rosewood may have adjusted the graves, and they probably thought they were doing the right thing perhaps at that time, but he may not have been there when they were actually shoring up the actual cemetery itself.
Right. This leads into the question of whether or not permission may have been given to outside of Marsden, Mid-Ocean or Bermuda Properties Limited to go ahead and carry out those works. Because you were not involved in that process, is that possible?
That's a possibility, but I can't say yay or nay if that actually happened.
Okay, thank you. The graves that existed outside of the wall, were there any evidence of these graves, visual?
Not visually, they were underground surveys that were done. So the guy looks down and he has a scientific way of figuring out where bodies could possibly be.
Okay, and is that the only site that they did the survey over?
As far as I know. Now, they haven't gone, it's a pretty big area down there. There's 2 18-hole golf courses and whatever. So people had, various locations around the Tuckerstown area. I don't think they went over the whole 36 holes of golf courses and, and properties or whatever to try to locate graves. I think they just looked at the graves itself and the area that was close to it.
Just the area that was close to
it, right.
So there's a possibility that those grave sites can actually exist and you not know about it?
Yes.
On the same property?
I would say to you, in the whole of Tuckerstown area, there could be other graves in the area prior to the church's establishment down there, because we came about in the early 1930s. So I'm sure people were living and working down there prior to that. And how they buried people at that time, we just don't know.
Because of that uncertainty, would the church have considered, in conjunction with Bermuda Properties or Mid-Ocean, doing a proper survey of the area to ensure that the graves were not desecrated or...
Possibly that's something that we can pursue, but I think Reverend Reardon might have some comments on that as well. If you could ask that same question again, so both of us can respond.
Thank you. That's all I have. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mrs. Spence. That's all your questions? Mrs. Spence? That's it?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
Mr. Stubble?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Morning, Mr. Tucker. I'm going to be as brief as I possibly can be. Would it be fair to say that the trauma experienced during the expropriation caused many people in your family great pain?
Some they did, some they didn't. Some people are still quite upset the fact that they moved out of there. And some people thought that, they got a new church, they got a schoolroom, they got property, they got land. Some, I wouldn't say they were happy about it, but they were accepting of it at that particular time. But there are certainly probably a similar amount that were totally discouraged, and they wanted to remain down there. As you've probably heard about Miss Aunt Dinah, who essentially was forced out of there. So you had a bit on both sides.
So within that context, it's safe to say that there's a multi-generational effect.
Yes.
If the cemetery was never deeded to the Bermuda Development Company, how did any work become authorized to be carried out?
You would have to speak to Bermuda Properties on that.
Well, what I'm saying is, if they didn't earn it, how did they get the authority to carry out any work?
They didn't earn it, and we didn't have access to it without their permission. So that's the bottom line. So you have to figure out how they can go ahead and restore it.
Well, I didn't even talk about restoring. I'm just saying ownership is one thing, access is another. You could get a helicopter and land it on there. But how does one get authority to carry out works on somebody else's property?
Well, essentially, they cannot. They would need the owner's permission to be able to do that. But where the additional bodies were found, historically, we don't know what the original boundary was for the actual graveyard. So where those other bodies are, could actually been property that may have been deeded to the Bermuda Development Company, and it may not be within the actual graveyard. If I'm just making sure that I'm clear, so you understand.
Right, I mean,
Because they're outside of what we had determined was the actual graveyard itself.
right. I understand what you're trying to say. You're actually buttressing my point, in that the real extent of the graveyard would supersede an incorrect deed.
I would assume so. I would assume so. I'm not a legal expert, but I would assume so.
Right. Has Marsden strenuously defended its burial ground rights historically, or has it typically acquiesced to the recreational use of subsequent developers?
Well, I think the church itself has always been concerned about the graveyard. It's just that a lot of people didn't talk to it for a number of years. In fact, some of the people that you've probably interviewed to this point, father was actually a trustee at Marsden Church, and they never talked about it for years and years. There were people that were associated with the church that never really talked about the graveyard at all, and most of those people now have pretty much passed on. So really it took to the 70s and 80s essentially before we actually got involved and had a movement on to try to, I mean, we were the first, I believe, to have a service down there, and we invited the whole community to come. We sought permission from Bermuda Properties. They gave us golf carts and all that sort of stuff, and they shut the golf course down. But there were a couple of services that Marsden had on its own down there prior to their trying to fix up in terms of the graveyard, fix the graveyard.
And
I don't
okay,
know if that
this is my last question,
Okay.
and it's just within the context of Bermuda. We have many graveyards on many islands in many parishes. Are you aware of any other graveyards, cemeteries in Bermuda being dealt with in a manner in which the Tuckerstown Methodist Cemetery has been dealt with?
I don't know of any, but there are certain other areas in Bermuda. I think at the bottom of near PHC, there, that little parking lot that's there. There's a statue or something there that says there were, I think, once graves or something like that. I'm not 100% sure, but I think there's a monument or something that reflects that, because I think it's called the St. Mary's Church, I believe. I think the graveyard might have been on the other side where that parking lot is, where they sell vegetables and all that stuff there. But I think it's a plaque there where people might have been buried there. But I don't know how that would have been handled, and that was quite some time ago.
And when I say that, I mean they're memorialized, they're maintained, they're protected, and we don't see that, or we haven't seen that with this cemetery.
You are correct, yes.
Madam Chair, I'm finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Tucker.
Council Harrison, is there anything arising from the questions of Commission Council that you wish to pick up on? Any of the answers given?
Nothing, thank you.
Okay. I guess the next step then is to the PowerPoint presentation. But before doing so, would you agree, Council, that we should swear Pastor Reverend Whalen, because he's going to be part of the presentation? Yes?
Yes, Madam
Yeah.
Chairman, I propose to have
could
him
we
sworn.
have I don't know, Mrs. Dyer Tucker, if you so wish to swear Reverend Whalen, please.
What I propose, Madam Chairman, is to start and lead his evidence, and then we could go to the PowerPoint thereafter, because he has a statement also. I would just like to take him through it.
To ask some questions in relation to that.
You would repeat after me. I, Joseph Whelan,
I, Joseph Whalen,
swear by Almighty God
swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence that I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the
the
truth,
whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much.
Witness has been sworn. Good morning again, sir.
Good morning.
Could you state your full name for the record?
Joseph Franklin Whalen, Jr.,
And your present address?
1 South Breakers Road, Smiths.
Could you state your occupation?
Clergy, pastor of a church.
Thank you. Could you also state your academic qualifications?
Graduated from Howard University, Masters of Divinity from Yale Divinity School, and a Doctor of Ministry degree from Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C.
Thank you. Are you familiar with the Marsden First United Methodist Church?
Yes, sir.
Could you tell me how?
I have been pastoring, serving as pastor for over 20 years.
Could you just went from 20 years dating from when? Are you presently the pastor?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Could you tell me?
Serving from 1999.
And you know Mr. Craig Tucker?
Very well.
Okay. And you know him in what capacity?
Well, as friend and brother, but mostly in our association at the church. As he said, he has been a lifelong member of Marsden, at that point Memorial Methodist Church now, as he stated, leading the church to an affiliation with the United Methodist Church. So I've known him the duration of my time at Marsden.
You're also familiar with the old Marsden Cemetery?
Yes, sir.
You are familiar with the Tuckerstown Historical Society?
Yes, sir.
You have provided a statement to this commission, the contents of which, can you recall them without reference to the statement? Can you tell us what is in it without looking at it?
Most of it will follow my PowerPoint.
Okay. You would like permission to make reference to the statement?
In association with the PowerPoint, if I may.
Yes. Just through you, Madam Chair, I'm just asking permission to allow him to make reference to his statement as also the PowerPoint presentation he intends to rely on.
Certainly, Counsel.
You have a copy of that statement there with you?
Yes, sir.
I'm going to take you through the statement first, and then after you can make reference to your PowerPoint. Okay? Or you wish to show us the PowerPoint first?
If I might.
Okay. Okay. You go ahead with the PowerPoint, I'll then fill in my questions after. The PowerPoint presentation, what does it refer to?
It follows basically the statement, but it also refers to evidence and information that has been submitted with regards to the concerns that the church has been engaged in dealing with Rosewood Tucker's Point, as Mr. Tucker mentioned, formerly Bermuda Properties and then Tucker's Point. Our collaboration with Tuckerstown Historical Society and with CURB in dealing with the issues of the cemetery.
Okay. So I'll allow you, could you take us to the PowerPoint presentation then?
I'll be happy to. Thank you.
Is that what's presented on the, what's projected is at the first page of the presentation?
Yes, sir.
Just the record could reflect that the projected on the screen is the first page of the PowerPoint presentation, Madam Chairman.
Thank you.
Just as a scriptural reference, it's Revelation 14 and 13, and I heard a voice from heaven saying, "Blessed or happy are those who die in the Lord from now on. Yes," says the Spirit, "they are blessed indeed, for they will rest from their hard work, for their good deeds follow them." And there's a picture of the cemetery, and I would suggest that whether or not they are resting in the knowledge of what is going on. The second slide.
Just before you go to the second slide, the first slide, can you say how recent that picture is?
This would be in 2010 or 11, or it's not a recent picture. This is a picture before, prior to 2012, when the restoration work was done.
And just for the record, because we have it to enter into the record, can you just share with us what does the picture depict? What is it showing us?
It depicts area of the cemetery designated by these boundary walls, and a gate which is broken, a plaque that is broken, the wall damage, golf balls that are in the cemetery. The cemetery designated with the grave tops and designating some of the graves there.
Can you, with reference, specific reference to the golf balls, I know Mr. Tucker gave evidence earlier and spoke of golf balls and his concern in respect of the preservation of this area. Could you comment on, if you have any comment at all, in respect of golf balls being in this area?
Yes, sir. And it'll become evident as I proceed that it is considered desecration. The reason why I chose the scripture, it says, for they will rest from their hard work. And usually burial ground is a place where it's a hallowed place, it's a sacred place for the dead to be at rest. And to me, there's no rest certainly for those who are the descendants with the knowledge of these condition in the golf balls. And it's not just that. At this particular time when this picture was taken, some vehicle, we were told, damaged the plaque that, if I'm permitted.
Please, thank you.
Yes. This plaque, which was put there by Morrison First United Methodist Church, or Morrison Memorial Church, as you can see, is cracked. The wall is damaged by a vehicle by Tucker's Point, then Tucker's Point, and it was a grave concern of the trustees and the members that these sort of things had occurred.
The damage to the plaque, the information in respect of how it was damaged, was that confirmed?
Yes, it was confirmed that one of their maintenance vehicles, if I
refer to
recall,
who? The
Tucker's Point. Tucker's Point, in maintaining their grounds, would also maintain the area of the cemetery. And I think it was just a cost, it was just the optics, I believe, because for concern for the broader cemetery, golf course. But anyway, this was why we ended up having a meeting. One of the first of many meetings. I don't think it was the first, but it was. We had a number of meetings, as my next slide would show.
Please proceed.
So as my statement states in the timeline, in 2007, June of 2007, myself as pastors, members of Marsden, met with, in addition with members of the Tuckerstown Historical Society, CURB, and representatives from Tucker's Point Club. A number of grievances and concerns were presented to Tucker's Point and discussed. Chief among them, number one, was the desecration of the graveyard by the driving range, depositing numerous golf balls. And the PowerPoint shows the actual letter that we sent and delivered and became a point of discussion to Tucker's Point. So this is the actual copy from that letter. It's not the entirety, but recommendations for the old Morrison graveyard to Tucker's Point from Morrison First United Methodist Church. And number one was to redirect the driving range so that golf balls do not land upon the graveyard. Two, provide, and this was subsequent to number one, a suitable covering canopy. Mr. Tucker was referring to this netting for the graveyard that would prevent golf balls from landing on it and enhance the appearance of this historic site. So this was, number two would be like an immediate redress in lieu of number one hopefully being done. Number three, for testing, allow for testing to determine if there are any graves outside of the walled areas that have been informed. We have been informed that the Bermuda Maritime Museum has such a machine. So this was, of course, what we had gathered from Dr. Ed Harris, that there was the capability to make determinations through a ground penetrating survey. I'm sorry?
No, please, go ahead.
Repair or replace the damaged plaque, consent for the site to be included on the African Diaspora Trail, and this would address the concern that Mr. Tucker spoke to about access, in which some of the commissioners were making a query as far as access, and it was considered that part of that access could be facilitated by actual involvement with the African diaspora, or diaspora, however you pronounce it, different ways, trail, and establish a written agreement between Morrison and Tucker's Point that includes safeguards for protecting the graveyard as sacred ground and as an historical site and acknowledgement of Morrison's representative role on behalf of the community at large.
When you speak of the protecting the graveyard as a sacred ground, you made reference earlier, which is indicated above, the repair or replace of the plaque. You mentioned that information is a vehicle had damaged the plaque.
That's what we were told.
Would you consider any recommendation that probably there should be no vehicular traffic around the site? Is that anything that had been considered?
To my knowledge, I don't think we spoke to that specifically. But
You may
we were,
continue.
yeah, we were sure. So this was the response from Tucker's Point, and it is provided. The actual copy.
Okay. You received a response from Tucker's Point,
Yeah, and it's included in your binder.
and the response you obtained, it is in the form of a letter,
Yes,
and is it dated?
yes.
Could you share with us the date?
Okay, it's okay. So in the binder, the first letter from Morrison is dated June 29th, 2007, which is Morrison at the top, Morrison 004. That's the letter we sent under Morrison 004.
So Maritime 004 represents a June 29, 2007 letter that you sent to
Right.
Tucker's Point.
And
Just a minute. Madam Chairman, Commissioners, have you located that document? Top right-hand corner, it's marked Marsden 004.
And you would note that there were other concerns. You know, I didn't include all of them on the PowerPoint that I
I'll
just
allow you
shared.
to take them to us shortly. This letter dated June 29, 2007, you personally sent it? You sent it yourself?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm going to ask,
behalf of the
Madam
trust.
Chairman, that this letter labeled Marsden 004 is tendered and admitted as exhibit.
Would that be Exhibit 2?
Exhibit 2. Exhibit
It's so
JFW2.
JFW. So entered.
Could you just read the letter to us? Reverend Whelan.
Okay, it's basically in the form of recommendations, and
Just read it as it is.
Yes, sir.
Date, everything included. Just please read from the date and
June 29th, 2007, recommendations for the old Morrison Graveyard to Tucker's Point Club from Morrison First United Methodist Church. Number 1, redirect driving range so that golf balls do not land upon the graveyard. 2, provide a suitable covering canopy for the graveyard that would both prevent golf balls from landing on it and enhance the appearance of this historic site. 3, allow for testing to determine if there are any graves outside of the walled area. In quote, in parentheses, we have been informed that the Bermuda Maritime Museum has such a machine. Number 4, extend the current walls to include any graves that may be found to exist outside the current perimeter of the graveyard and provide markers. 5, repair or replace the damaged plaque, keeping same wording. 6, have graves repaired and whitewashed. 7, establish an upkeep agreement. 8, consent for the site to be included in the African Diaspora Trail may also be a positive promotional point for Tucker's Point. 9, allow for a roadside historical marker. 10, establish appropriate community access to visit the graveyard. 11, if feasible, create a covered pathway to the graveyard, either from the clubhouse or from the road. 12, establish a written agreement between Morrison and Tuckers Point that includes safeguards for protecting the graveyard as sacred ground and as an historical site, and acknowledgement of Morrison's representative role on behalf of the community at large.
You had signed this letter.
This may have been what we actually brought to the meeting and presented. It may not have been a mailed letter. That's probably why it's in this particular form. If my recollection is correct, we went to the meeting and this is what we put before them.
Thank you. Now, this meeting, can you recall who was present at this meeting?
I can speculate.
Okay, I don't want you to do that. Okay, but you were present and you met with members from Tuckers Point Club.
Right, and to my knowledge, I believe there was representation from Tuckerstown Historical Society at the minimum. I'm not sure if anyone from CURB was involved with us at that particular time.
Thank you. Now, in response to these points that were raised, did the church or the trustees receive a response?
Yes, sir.
Could you make reference to it?
Okay. And this is in what is in your packet under Morrison 005, the letter from Tuckers Point Club dated April 14th, 2009. It's addressed.
Sorry, just 1 minute, thank you. Madam Chairman, in respect of the document with the words Morrison 005, dated April 14, 2009, asked that to be 10 admitted as exhibit.
That's the April 14th letter?
It is, Madam Chairman. Could it be 10 admitted as exhibit JFW 3?
So entered.
Thank you. Could you go ahead, read it for us?
Okay, it is addressed to Mr. Craig Tucker, Chairman, Morrison, Trustee Board, care of Bank of Bermuda Limited, Front Street, Hamilton. Dear Mr. Tucker, it was a pleasure to meet with you and the representatives of Morrison Methodist Church last week, at which time we reviewed your memo outlining certain maintenance issues related to the graveyard and the perception among some people that the graveyard was being desecrated because of its proximity to the Tuckers Point driving range. The following represents our response to the matters raised in the meeting and actions we are committed to undertake. Number one, move the driving range. We noted there was no land available at Tuckers Point to move the driving range, and the suggestion to close the driving range is not a practical alternative given the nature of the hotel and resort operation. Two, better protection of the graveyard. We discussed various methods to prevent golf balls from entering the graveyard. Tuckers Point has agreed to consider a number of alternatives, including additional netting. We have this week commissioned an architect to design a net structure to fully protect the graveyard, and we'll be pleased to present our plans to the church as soon as the design has been completed. Three, replace the plaque. Tuckers Point Club agreed to replace the existing marble plaque and has suggested a bronze plaque. Four, repair damaged walls. The walls had been repaired prior to the meeting, and Tuckers Point has undertaken to maintain the walls in the future. Repair damaged gate. This repair was completed prior to the meeting. We hope that Tucker's Point undertaking to maintain and respect the heritage of the graveyard will alleviate your concerns. It is with regret and concern that we report that this week an individual without permission from Tucker's Point, and we understand without permission from the church, has painted the tombstones and gravestones. While undoubtedly well-intentioned, this action represents an unacceptable trespass and violation of private property. With kind regards, and a signed Mark Orchard. Copies to the trustees, Gil, myself, Pastor Gil Tucker, Mr. Burgess, Delroy Duncan, and Ed Tripp of Tucker's Point Club, and Mr. Peter Parker, Tucker's Point Club, or more appropriately, Bermuda.
And Mr. Mark Orchard, who was he?
Mr. Mark Orchard, Senior Vice President.
Now, in respect of the said exhibit at the last paragraph, where you mentioned where it's mentioned that it is with regret and concern that we report that this week an individual without permission from Tucker's Point, and we understand without permission from the church, has painted the tombstones and gravestones. While undoubtedly well-intended, this action represents an unacceptable trespass and violation of private property. Would you wish to comment on that? In respect of, did anything come to your mind when you heard of this happening?
I can't recall.
And even now, well, how do you feel about that someone has painted the tombstones and the gravestones?
Well, I thought it was it was like it was a good thing. It was well intentioned or whatever. I mean, with regards to this letter, I was more concerned about the first paragraph. I think I was. My recollection, and still it disturbs me, and what they said, the perception among some people that the graveyard was being desecrated, and the whole thing disturbs me. And
tell me why.
Because to me, it's saying, we really don't have a problem. We really don't see a problem. The problem is with the perception that certain people have that, the graveyard is being desecrated, but we don't really feel that way.
You don't think it's a perception, you think it actually was being desecrated, is that so?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think, as Mr. Tucker mentioned, we were on the same page, Tuckerstown Historical Society, CURB, everybody that I have ever talked to feels that it's a travesty, however you want to put it, desecration.
I'm sure we'll come to it in your PowerPoint presentation, but arising out of this exhibit J3, there are a number of things in the letter that the senior vice president spoke to. This is now 2020. Have these things been addressed? Let's start with the following represents our response to the matters raised in the meeting and the actions we are committed to undertake. 1, remove the driving range. I know, Mr. Tucker, beside you spoke of 200 acres that it could be moved elsewhere. The comment here, we noted there was no land available at Tucker's Point to move the driving range. And the suggestion to close the driving range is not a practical alternative given the nature of the hotel and resort operation. To your knowledge, has the driving range been moved?
No, sir. And as that first paragraph suggests, that it doesn't seem like it's a pressing problem, in my perception.
Thank you. Number 2 speaks of better protection of the graveyard.
We have been up and down like a yo-yo in dealing with this back and forth with Tucker's Point, Rosewood Tucker's Point. They keep on bringing a design, a proposal, an attempt, and it always fails. At one time, they had a general manager who had been over a golf club in the U.S. that had a similar issue, and he told us that they managed to have some kind of protective covering, and that he was going to pursue this as a solution, a resolution. It never went anywhere. So it's been a failure. The attempts over the years, word given, word broken, in terms of protecting the graveyard with protective netting or any kind of covering, has been a failure on their part. And we keep on, we have gotten assurances, we've met with the owners, Mr. Tripp and others, and nothing adequate has transpired. Now there's no net at all down there.
Thank you. In respect of number 3, replace the plaque. TPC agreed to replace the existing marble plaque and has suggested a bronze plaque.
That has been done.
Number 4 says the walls had been prepared prior to the meeting, and Tucker's Point has undertaken to maintain the walls in the future. Can you speak to that? Has
that was done.
Have the walls been maintained?
I don't know what that means. I don't know how you maintain walls.
Repair number 5, repair damaged gate. This repair was completed prior to the meeting.
Yes, sir, to my knowledge, yes, sir.
At the foot of the first page of the document, we hope that Tucker's Point's undertaking to maintain and respect the heritage of the graveyard will alleviate your concerns. Have your concerns been alleviated?
No, sir. We wouldn't be sitting here today if they had followed our recommendations, requests. And we've had numerous meetings.
We could continue with your PowerPoint presentation. Thank you.
Okay. So I've already spoken to the June meeting and to the last point, subsequent meetings, communications, and a documentary film. I think that was part of the big conversation. Failed to resolve the matter despite verbal and written assurances from Tucker's Point Club that certain key issues would be addressed. To date, Tucker's Point Club failed to fulfill their agreement to stop the continued desecration of the graveyard with a sufficiently protective netting. In 2011, a letter was sent from Marsden to 2 government ministers, Derek Burgess and Wayne Parentchief.
Just before you go in further, who sent that letter?
It was sent. I sent it on behalf of the trustees and the, at the time, anniversary committee of the church.
Okay, that document is labeled Marsden 006.
Yes, sir.
And it's dated July 13, 2011.
Yes, sir. This is the generic. The copies to the individual persons
Well, the original
was
sent to them.
I'm saying that each letter had the individual's name on it. It was specifically their name. It was addressed to it. But this is the generic letter. This is the same letter that was sent to all, except that instead of saying greetings, it would have
The
their...
person's name.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Madam Chairman, could I ask that the document which is labeled Maritime 006 is tender admitted as Exhibit JFW4?
JMW4, Marsden 006, dated July 13, 2011. Enter.
Thank you. Please proceed. Could you read that letter to us?
Yes, sir. July 13, 2011. Greetings. I am writing to solicit your help in redressing some unresolved issues regarding the old Tuckerstown graveyard. This year in October, Morrison First United Methodist Church will celebrate its 150th year anniversary. Our history has its roots in Tuckerstown heritage. Landmarks such as an old chapel, schoolhouse, and community store still stand today as private residence. These structures, and most importantly, the old graveyard, are all that remain of the old predominantly black rural community. In 1996, the graveyard was rededicated to honor those who are buried there. The descendants are not only members of Morrison, but individuals from across our island home. As you may know, the old Tuckerstown graveyard exists in the middle of the Tuckers Point Golf Course, more specifically below the clubhouse in an area used as a driving range. There is too much history for me to cover in this letter, so let me get straight to the point. In June 2007, the pastor and designated representatives from Marsden met with members of the Tuckerstown Historical Society, CURB, Citizens Uprooting Racism in Bermuda, and representatives from Tuckers Point Club. A number of grievances and concerns were presented to Tuckers Point and discussed. See attached document dated June 2007. Chief among these were the desecration of graveyard by the driving range, depositing numerous golf balls. Subsequent meetings, communications, and a documentary film have failed to resolve the matter. This despite verbal and written assurances from Tuckers Point that certain key issues would be addressed. See attached letter from Tuckers Point dated April 14, 2009. Tuckers Point has defaulted on the following. Number one, Tuckers Point Club agreed to stop the continued desecration of graveyard. They promised to sufficiently protect the area with a net. This has not been done. They were told over 2 years ago that the flimsy net that is by the hedges is totally inadequate, which they acknowledged and promised to replace. Anyone who visits the graveyard on any given day will find the site desecrated by numerous golf balls. 2, Tuckers Point Club agreed to replace the plaque which Morrison erected on the wall of the graveyard that was severely damaged by their machines. This has not been done. Tuckers Point Club agreed to repair the damaged wall. This also has not been done. Number 4, Tuckers Point Club agreed to allow for scanning of the area so that a determination can be made of the location of remains of the deceased. Mr. Ed Harris, the director of the Maritime Museum, informed me in June of this year that Tuckers Point Club refused to give him access to the area. Over 4 years after our meeting to resolve these issues, and more than 2 years after Tuckers Point Club agreed to rectify key issues, nothing has been done. The attached pictures were taken on July 12, 2011. Although the picture quality is not the best, they do provide an actual visual representation of the situation. As we plan to hold our 150th anniversary, Marsden intends to invite the community together at the old Tuckerstown graveyard. It would be a shame for the community to gather and witness the continuation of a disregard for a people's heritage and one of their holy grounds. We anticipate once again a community outcry over this issue. On behalf of our congregation and the many across this island who are concerned about these issues, I solicit your assistance. Thank you. Joseph F. Whalen, Jr., Pastor.
Could you just remind us who are the letters written to? Each letter was written to? Who are the persons written to?
The letter was written to two government ministers, Derek Burgess, Wayne Parent Chief, representatives for our constituency. I didn't include the name. And I do have that information. I can give you that. Appealing for assistance in our efforts. And also, a letter was sent to Brian Young and Ed Tripp of Tuckers Point Club. Brian Young was the then general manager.
Okay. Could you just clarify something for us? Earlier we went through what is Exhibit JFW 03, and I had asked you earlier about item number 4, repair damaged walls. The walls had been repaired prior to the meeting, and Tucker's Point had undertaken to maintain the walls in the future. And in answer to me earlier, you indicated that the walls had been fixed. But now at Exhibit JF04, in the letter that you wrote to the two ministers at item 3, you have 3 TPC agreed to repair the damaged wall. This also has not been done. So in one letter, I drew your attention to repair, and you had indicated that it had been, and in the other letter, the later letter, 2 years later, you have that it was not done. Was the wall, to your knowledge, repaired?
I cannot clarify that. I'm trying to follow. You're referring to
the letter dated April 14th and the letter dated July 13th.
July 13th.
In the April 14th letter, at item number 4 on page 1, under the heading Repair Damaged Walls, it has the walls had been prepared prior to the meeting, and I had asked you earlier whether in fact this was so. I believe you had indicated that the wall, to your knowledge, had been repaired, and what I'm bringing to your attention is that in the letter dated July 13th, which is the exhibit number 4, JFW4, at item number 3, you have, to the letter that you sent, you have TPC agreed to repair the damaged wall. This also has not been done.
Right, so I would defer to the letter July 13th, 2011, because I believe that Mr. Orchard may have been mistaken.
Okay. Thank you. Madam Chairman, what time do you normally have your research?
Well, during our previous sessions, we usually break at 12, but I was asked to break today at 12:30. So I was going to indicate at a convenient point we can break anytime now, because I believe it's about 12:25?
Yes, it's a convenient time.
This is a good time?
It's a convenient time.
This is a convenient point. Okay, so Mr. Tucker and Pastor Whalen, we will take the break now, and then we will resume at 2 o'clock. At 2 o'clock, because usually they take an hour and a half by the time the lunch gets here, and they've eaten and refreshed themselves. We usually take an hour and a half. So we'll resume at 2 o'clock, please. Thank you.